bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Well, welcome, everybody, to Society and the State, episode 66. Today, we're talking about the Constitution, and perhaps a different Constitution, perhaps a better Constitution than the one that we're familiar with. It'll be a fun conversation. We are joined with the author of this new and very interesting proposal for a Constitution, Trey Goff, recent grad, actually, of Mississippi State, studied both economics and political science, and has kind of made a mark in a lot of liberty circles for putting this document out there that we're going to be talking about today. Trey, thanks for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me, Connor. I appreciate it.
So Brian and I have both read what I think I've seen differently described as a liberty constitution, as a voluntarist constitution. And I found this quite interesting because in many of the circles that we work in politically, there is almost a reverence, if not almost a deification, if I can use the word, of the United States Constitution. So let me maybe first begin our conversation before we get into what you've written and some of the different and even radical proposals that you have. Talk to us about why you feel the existing Constitution is insufficient to, fulfill its purposes, to protect our rights, etc.
So I don't want to step on any toes by insulting the U.S. Constitution too much, because I think it's important to clarify that for the time when the Constitution was created, it was an absolutely revolutionary document that for the first, I would say, 50 or 60 years of the United States functioned as it should have, and it birthed what is arguably the most prosperous and free nation and population to have ever existed. So it's not that it didn't do a good job, but at the same time, looking back now, 250 years later, we can look back and see how some clauses of the Constitution and some portions of the Constitution have been utilized by forces contrary to the liberty we would desire, to expand the state and to perpetually shrink the sphere within which we can utilize a lot of those rights, with the Second Amendment being a beautiful example in recent memory. But you have things like the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution, or the General Welfare Clause, several doorways within the Constitution that have allowed the state to expand to a level the Founding Fathers would have found absolutely abhorrent today. So that was what kind of my inspiration for pursuing a rewrite, if you will, was to say, okay, these guys did a great job the first go around, but we've had 250 years of experience to look back and say, here's some areas we could have improved, here's some areas we could change, and that if we were given, this was kind of meant as a thought experiment as well, if we were given the possibility to say, hey, let's start a new society today, predicated on the principles of liberty that we have learned and developed over the last 200 years, what would that Constitution look like? And this is what came out of that thought experiment.
And is this new proposal that you've come up with, is this something of your own creation? Is this, you and for some friends or some scholars got together? Or what's the genesis of what we're going to be talking about shortly?
Yeah, I worked on it. So I got the idea with a friend of mine. His name's Cesar Balmaceda. And then we kind of worked on it some. And then I ended up taking it and running with it after that. And the version you see before you is almost entirely of my own creation. I pulled some ideas from it from, I don't know if you know who, Roderick Long, who's another kind of good libertarian thinker. He had a constitution floating around the internet. I pulled some portions from it that I liked. And then other than that, Murray Rothbard and law professor Randy Barnett. Sorry, I can remember his name.
Randy. Yep.
Yeah, Randy Barnett were two of my biggest inspirations for this, because they have both been two great legal thinkers and philosophical thinkers in this arena. And Randy specifically talks about the need for a constitution of this sort. Even if you were to have the ideal libertarian polycentric legal order, you would still need this sort of constitution. He talks about that in the Structure of Liberty. So a lot of the ideas for this I got from those two thinkers primarily.
Trey, let's have you describe for us some of the contrasts between the Voluntaryist Constitution and the United States Constitution. So
first and foremost, I set out at the very beginning of the document with a definition section, which I think is one of the biggest problems with the U.S. Constitution, is that a lot of the terms aren't clearly defined. So the Supreme Court and progressive activists, rather, over the last 200 and 150 years have been able to take and twist the meaning of some of these words to mean whatever they want it to mean. With, again, things like the General Welfare Clause or the Commerce Clause being perfect examples of that. The Interstate Commerce Clause was not meant to allow the state to regulate every single action that an individual takes, down to providing justification for the state to destroy a man's crops in his own backyard, as has happened with Supreme Court cases previously. But the progressive and leftist forces have been able to utilize the ambiguity of those terms to expand the Constitution and expand the power of the state, rather, to be more or less whatever they want it to be. So I set out at the very beginning of this to try to very clearly define some terms that could be considered ambiguous in this document, so that you avoid that problem in the future. Now, of course, it is at the end of the day just words on paper, and the only way stuff like this works is if the people who are agreeing to it agree to a shared set of principles and ideals and norms and values. But given that supposition, that assumption, then hopefully this clarification should make this document a little less ambiguous in the Constitution. And I also tried to clarify as much as possible the preeminence of property rights over almost anything else within the document, something which the Constitution does not directly do. Property rights does not directly appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. But as we know from a study of both economics and political philosophy, a society predicated on property rights is, and the absolute protection of property rights, is the only society within which you're going to see the maximal human flourishing. It is the only society within which where you're going to see a truly equitable and fair system of justice and system of trade and commerce and interaction between individuals more broadly at a collective level. So that's the two biggest differences, I think. Now,
I should note for our listeners who are following along, obviously they have not read this. We are going to be linking to this on the show notes page for today, which is societyandthestate.com/66. And so make sure to go there. We will link directly over to this so our listeners can digest what we're talking about. And it's not that long, right? Like the U.S. Constitution is, have you done a word count? Like this appears to be like a third or half the length of the United States Constitution. Yeah, it ended up being roughly half the number of words. I can't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, and that was one of my objectives, actually, was I didn't want this to end up being too long. Now, that brings me to another important distinction I want to make very briefly between the U.S. Constitution and what I've written as well. I intended this to be the foundational legal document for any prospective new startup society. But it's based on the idea that this will be a contract, basically. So this will be the kernel. If you're familiar with software, this will be the kernel that everyone else is able to build the rest of their software off of, if that makes sense. So I made no distinction between, well, this creates a democracy or this creates an aristocracy or an epistocracy or whatever. I left that completely open. What this is meant to be is just the base foundational legal contract between residents who are voluntarily agreeing to consent to live in a collective and communal society with one another. And then from that, they can build whatever sort of governance institutions they want to, knowing that they've already agreed to this set of societal and legal norms and rules beforehand. And I found that interesting, too, when we were just talking about the length. Obviously, the United States Constitution really formulates the different branches of government and how they'll interoperate. And obviously, with your proposal not containing any of that, of course, it then becomes easier to reduce it in length. And so just to be very clear, your goal, your pie in the sky notion here is not only could this be used for, let's say, a seasteading initiative or, a startup society in northern Honduras where they're doing the ZEDE out there and kind of coming up with new governmental systems. You are proposing that a constitution like this could indeed be applied, layered on top of, or slipped under the foundation of an existing government. Do you really foresee that as being possible? I think it could be. Now, I will, of course, grant that the likelihood of that is next to nil, because whatever government or governing entity that would accept this constitution would be immediately restricting their own powers to next to nothing, which, as we all know, the state is not want to restrict its power any. Not exactly. But I at least entertain that as a possibility. Yeah. Now, I think more likely is that something like this would be utilized in a completely new greenfield site or a new societal structure altogether. As more jurisdictions pop up
precisely because of some of the initiatives you just described. I think the likelihood that we'll start seeing more jurisdictions that are experimenting in other forms of governance will come up, and hopefully one of those will one day stumble upon my document and think it workable enough that they could use it as the foundation moving forward for their society, their jurisdiction.
Trey, it seems that one of the key areas where we've seen kind of a perversion of original intent of the U.S. Constitution is how justice has come to serve the interest of the state more so than the actual cause of justice. Let's talk about how you address justice in the Voluntaryist Constitution.
Right. So I wanted to make as perfectly clear as possible in my Constitution that there was no moral distinction between an individual actor and a state actor, in the sense that Jason Brennan, one of my favorite philosophers, calls this the moral parity thesis. So basically, you have moral parity with any other actor, whether they be a government or another individual. So the objective here was to make sure that justice reflected a violation of property rights and the restoring of your rights and of the value of yourself and your property back to their previous value before they were aggressed against, basically. So the objective here was to make it so that you don't have an unfair predisposition for state actors as you do now. Now you have things like civil immunity, and you have stuff like the indictment rates for police officers being like something like 4%, incredibly low. The point being, and it may very well be the case that police officers oftentimes have false charges brought against them. My point is more broadly is that indictment rates for the rest of society, for instance, are 97%. So that disparity cannot just be explained by a constant stream of false charges, but also has to do with the fact that juries and judges alike in the current political culture give state actors a benefit of the doubt and an idea that they, for some reason, can get away with actions that would be completely immoral for any other actor in society. So what I tried to make as abundantly clear as possible is that everyone is on a perfect moral parity, meaning there's no one who has a moral right to utilize violence against any other individual any more than anyone else does, and that violence can only be used in a defensive manner and to restore the rights of individuals, and that's it.
Now, many people, Trey, perceive constitutions to be grants of authority to a government. So, for example, and it's actually, I found over the years, it's actually an inverse with U.S. constitutions and state constitutions by virtue of the fact that many people hold this theory that states have all inherent authority to do whatever they wish as long as their state constitutions prohibit them from doing so. And then the theory of the U.S. Constitution is that the federal government may only do those things for which it has been delegated authority in the U.S. Constitution. And so people perceive that at the state level, at least, the legislature can do whatever they want as long as they are not, forbidden from doing so in their state constitution. So I found that discrepancy to be rather odd. Right, this presumption that states have all, there's a term for it, maybe I'll remember in a minute. It's not coming to me. Maybe I'll remember a little bit later. But this presumption that they have all supreme authority, that we the people have just delegated all of our power, and then it's in their infinite wisdom that they restrain themselves and only wield this maximum power in whatever way that they want. My question is, in your voluntarist or liberty constitution, which approach have you taken? Are you conferring limited powers to a government, or is it presumed that whatever government that operates underneath this constitution has broader authority but has certain limits placed upon it? Or is there somewhere in between or something different?
Yeah, so I tried as much as humanly possible to restrict the possibility that a state could end up forming and looking anything like the current United States government does. So I think it's Section 5 toward the end of the Constitution. It's the very last thing in the Constitution, actually, is a section of prohibitions, which I was just trying to use as a catch-all to prevent the government from expanding into the relative monstrosity that we see the U.S. government being today. So it's a very explicit prohibition of a number of actions that are specifically geared toward prohibiting the state from doing things such as stealing people's private property via civil asset forfeiture or instituting direct income taxation, stuff like that is at the end of the document very explicitly meant to make it clear that nothing in the beginning 4 sections of the document can be construed as giving a state some sort of unlimited power or unlimited discretion.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's very important, right? Like those prohibitions become really the teeth and you think of like the Fourth Amendment. I mean, the U.S. Constitution in our day has been, broadly misinterpreted and amplified and stretched and warped. And as you point out, the definitions have taken on almost an inverse meaning of what they did at the time of the ratification. And so having those prohibitions, you think of like in our Constitution, one of the best parts of it is the Fourth Amendment, right, against unreasonable searches and seizures. And that has provided, at least to some degree, a good check and balance against the encroachments of the state in a law enforcement, surveillance, privacy, search and seizure context. And so these prohibitions really become the enforcement mechanism. But that leads me to my next question. If your Constitution is agnostic on the form of government, what is, in your mind, the enforcement mechanism? Is it private judicial systems? Is it just, could it be a state operating under this, and then you have, their court system? Or what are the remedies, and what's the enforcement mechanism to ensure that these prohibitions that you've listed, and there's what looks like there's 10 of them, that they're actually enforced?
So it could very well be that a state utilizes this document as its founding principles, as its founding constitution, and then moves forward from there. But I envision this ideally as operating under what Dr. Randy Barnett calls a polycentric legal order, which is a legal order in which everyone who is under the jurisdiction of this Constitution has voluntarily and expressly consented to it, and that most dispute resolution, which is all that justice really is at the end of the day, is dispute resolution, occurs through completely fair and neutral private arbitration. So in this particular case, the goal would be that if a state entity or any actor within the society violates the precepts of this Constitution by violating someone's property rights, well, then that it constitutes a good legal standing in any of the arbitration firms or any of the judges operating within the jurisdiction of this Constitution. Now, I would also envision that if we're a state to form in the society within which this Constitution reigns supreme, then you would ensure that you have some sort of third-party arbitration or litigation mechanism, because right now the problem we have is it's whenever you have a case brought against a government actor, it's in government courts in the United States.
Right.
Now, I know there's supposed to be, of course, separation of powers and everything, but at the end of the day, if you look at indictment rates and enforcement rates and things like that, it becomes immediately clear that it is, in fact, the government basically trying itself for violating your rights, which, as we know, isn't exactly a fair and just way to resolve disputes between yourself and the state.
Right.
So I would hope that if you're in a society utilizing this Constitution, that you would have some sort of third-party enforcement mechanism, such as arbitration in a third-party legal regime of some sort, hopefully, again, private arbitration, that can settle the dispute in a fair and impartial manner instead of the state trying itself for violating your rights.
Trey, I think it's been brought up that as good as any constitution may be, ultimately it's words on paper. If liberty is going to thrive and survive, that's going to start in the hearts and minds of the people of that particular area. What would you recommend people do, or how do you recommend people get their hearts and their minds around liberty so that those words on paper actually have effect and have power? I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, I firmly believe in the mission of things like the Libertas Institute and the Mises Institute and the Foundation for Economic Education that are fighting to change hearts and minds, so to speak, to just simply make people understand that the beauty and human flourishing and justice that can occur in a completely free society predicated upon the mutual respect for private property rights. However, I'm of another mind, which is that doing that, although effective, takes a long time. So in the meantime, the most effective means of trying to enact liberty and institute liberty now is to act, is to do something, is to build it. So this is one of the mottos of one of my good friend Joe McKinney's group, the Startup Societies Foundation. Don't talk, build. So in that sense, seeking to do things in your personal life by being economically successful, by participating in market processes and forces, to be able to show people that liberty works, that free markets and voluntary exchange and peaceable interaction between individuals works, and that it is that voluntary exchange, those market forces, and that peaceable interaction
that is at the genesis and at the core of all human prosperity and human flourishing. And once people come to realize that, and once you show them that through action, then it becomes a lot more simple to say, hey, maybe our political institutions should reflect this reality that we both recognize, which is that voluntary, mutual, value-for-value exchange is the way toward human prosperity and flourishing.
I think that's so important, too, because if you look at when the United States was founded, there was a worldwide skepticism that this experiment would take off, but then it did. And you look at the consequences of that. Not only, as you pointed out earlier, did it have, birthed one of the freest, most prosperous countries the world has ever seen, but you have well over 100 other countries now that have adopted constitutions that are based in large part, or at least significant part, upon our own. Right? They've wanted to kind of redo their constitutions, or new countries have, broken off of other ones, and they've looked to the United States Constitution as a model and a guide. And to many degrees, as we know, the Constitution has been insufficient. And so here you come, and others may come in the future with a proposal for something different. And I love this idea about applying it somewhere new, somewhere where you have an opportunity to start clean, one of these startup societies, hopefully. And let's build, and let's show the opportunity that comes, the safety and security that comes, the liberty that comes, and then others will want to follow. It becomes much easier, I think, to amend another country's constitution if there's an example. So, when we go up to the legislature in our work at Libertas, one of the first questions that legislators will always ask us is, well, what other states are doing this? No one wants to be the leader. No one wants the arrows in their back. They want to see that it's being done successfully elsewhere. They want to see data. And so if you can find places to start with something like this, prove its concept, prove the model, then it becomes much easier to try and bring up these other guys along. Trey, I want to ask you a final question before we conclude, something that caught my attention in the preamble of this constitutional proposal that you've written. We've kind of skirted around the edges. You mentioned Randy Barnett, polycentric law, talking about consent. You say in here that this Constitution is only applicable to those who have explicitly, voluntarily, and of their own free will and accord signed it, as well as their children, their guests, and their visitors. Why put this in there? And if you feel so strongly about this, do you see that as one of the biggest deficiencies of the existing Constitution that is tied to geography? Everybody is inherently and automatically subjected to it, whether or not they've actually explicitly consented. Is that explicit consent so necessary in your mind, and if so, why?
Absolutely. It is, in fact, that explicit consent that, on the one hand, to me, morally justifies any constitution or any legal order. And then, on the other hand, it is also the mechanism by which you can create a market for competitive governance, if you will, and to steal the words of Tom Bell, and create a system wherein governance providers are competing for your business rather than simply entrapping you and saying, oh, you were born here, so you're going to live by my rules whether you like it or not. So no contract is valid unless it was voluntarily consented to. And if the Constitution, the foundational legal document of a given society, is to be anything construed as a contract, then it must be voluntarily consented to. So that is of utmost importance for completely moral reasons. It is immoral to force upon someone obligations and interactions that they did not consent to and have no way to avoid, which is the way the current system works under this supposed social contract, wherein I just, by accident of being born somewhere, I have somehow magically consented to the rule of the parties that exist there. On the other hand, if you could cultivate a system wherein there are many competing jurisdictions, all of which have to be voluntarily consented to, then you can create what is effectively a market for governance. This is taking what's called the Thibault theorem in economics and applying it to governance instead of just public goods. And in this sort of environment, you would create constant incentives and constant pressure as governance providers compete for profit by attracting more residents and more business. You would have constant pressure toward the maximization of liberty and the maximization of prosperity instead of what we see today with nation states, which is a constant pressure toward ever larger bureaucracy and ever larger state interaction in our day-to-day lived experience.
That's great, Trey. This has been very mind-tickling and very fun to chat about. Obviously, there's a lot more to sink our teeth into, and especially for our listeners, you're going to want to go pull up this constitutional proposal, give it a read. It's not very long. We will link to the proposal. We will link Trey, to your website. We're also going to link to a previous episode that Brian and I did, kind of spinning off of what you just talked about this so-called social contract. So we'll link to that past episode if anyone missed it. All of these links will be on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/66. Trey, thanks so much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.